Hi, welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks for joining me today. A while ago, I was having a conversation with a friend, and she mentioned that she had been speaking to a different friend, and that friend was feeling some shame because she worried or felt that she might be too attached to her therapist. And so I wanted to talk about this because I know that this is an issue for a lot of people. Not necessarily that they become too attached, but attachment to their therapist in general, because it can be really difficult to allow yourself to feel that you are in relationship with your therapist. And it can be the case for some people in some times to become too dependent on their therapist. And obviously neither end of that spectrum is really healthy, but it is still part of the process. And so I wanted to talk about that today. So, the interesting thing about attachment to your therapist is that so much of the healing that can happen in therapy is because of the nature of your relationship with your therapist. If it's not a healthy relationship, that's going to have a significant impact on you in a negative way. If it is a healthy relationship, then that is going to actually be an important part of what you experience that helps you heal. Particularly if we're talking about people that have attachment issues, who have childhood trauma, or who have been just hurt in a relationship. So one of the important things to keep in mind is that your therapist is part of her or his role is to help navigate that. It's to create a space and an environment where you feel safe and you can feel that vulnerability and kind of push through it a little bit so that you can feel a level of connection. And it's also that person's responsibility to make sure that you do not become too dependent or too attached, if we want to use that word. But in reality, as humans, we need connection and we need attachment. It's really important as children, but even in our adult lives, we need to feel a level of connection that feels real, that feels safe, and that feels that it matters and that we matter within that context. So naturally, as you create that, as you lean into that, there's going to be a level of attachment that happens. And as somebody who maybe struggles with being vulnerable or connection or attachment, with trust, with fear around relationships, it's going to bring up a lot of stuff. So this is certainly one of those things that you could ask different people and maybe get different responses to. So part of my background, part of my approach to therapy is relational therapy. And I think that generally speaking, childhood trauma, that's a really important part of the process for the reasons that I was just talking about. So when you begin therapy, and this is true for everybody, regardless of any sort of trauma history, it's vulnerable, right? You don't know this person yet. You're supposed to share all this stuff with them, and you're supposed to trust them in guiding you in a way that is going to be helpful to you. So there's inherently quite a bit of vulnerability there and risk, quite honestly. So just allowing yourself to lean into that vulnerability and practice is naturally going to create a sense of attachment. Now, you may try to distance yourself from that attachment, or you may really grab a hold of that attachment. But again, this is something that hopefully your therapist is going to be experienced in and can help you navigate that. So finding that balance, or really feeling that balance. So it's not so much that you have to find it, it's finding your way through it to that place of balance can be, I guess, challenging. It doesn't have to be all the time, but it often is. So when you're first leaning into that vulnerability and taking those risks and sharing yourself, even if you're not sharing anything particularly personal, it's still very vulnerable. So you want to lean into that, and you want to allow yourself to, in a sense, kind of rely on that therapist. Now, what I mean by rely on that therapist is more about trusting that therapist has your best interest in mind, that they can care about you. Now, that's different than how a family member might care about you or a friend might care about you. Now, the longer you're in relationship with that therapist, the therapist may care about you on a more kind of deep level. And that can be a little challenging too, because you have to be very mindful, or that person has to be mindful of making sure that they're not crossing a boundary there and making it a more personal relationship. And there are very important reasons why that is the case. But you do develop a relationship with this person. You have to be able to feel that when you're with them, when you're talking with them, that their focus is you. You're showing up for them, and you want to feel that they're showing up for you. And one of the things that comes up so often, and if you haven't thought about this consciously, there's probably a part of you that has still had thoughts about it. And that is, well, I'm paying this person, so therefore it's not really a relationship, or it's a transactional relationship. So I don't care if this person cares about me. They don't need to care about me. But particularly for childhood trauma survivors, it actually does feel like it matters, even if you're not consciously aware. And I think that that's true for anybody. Like if you have a friend who doesn't feel like they really care about you, you're not really going to want to share a lot with them, are you? You likely won't be able to really feel like you can trust them if you're not sharing things with them and they're not sharing things with you. So letting yourself lean into the relationship is important. Letting yourself share what's on your mind, what's on your heart, what you're struggling with, what your fears are. Again, that's vulnerable. And when you share yourself vulnerably and openly with somebody, that naturally creates connection. And that's a good thing. And a therapist, right, theoretically anyway, is supposed to be somebody that you can trust. And hopefully it is somebody that you can trust. And obviously I can't speak for every therapist, but generally speaking, hopefully it is somebody that you can trust, who is not going to betray that or disappoint you in terms of not being able to really help you. So as you lean into that, you're going to feel a level of connection. Now, it may take a long time, but eventually you will get there. And it takes a long time because of that level of trust. So allowing yourself to share with your therapist. If your therapist is okay with you calling in between sessions or emailing you in between sessions, or sharing your journal with them or whatever it is. If they've said that, then leaning in to trusting that is important, because that's part of the relational aspect. It's part of allowing yourself to begin to trust that when somebody is supportive or caring or kind or tells you that they're okay with this boundary, you learn to lean into trusting that, because that helps you recognize that you are deserving of that and you are worthy of that. It also helps you kind of let go of some of that codependency that you may have around feeling that, okay, even though this person is saying this, it's probably going to be too much for them. Or what if it's too much for them? Particularly if it's a therapist, working to trust that they can honor their own boundaries is important. So as you lean into that, it helps you recognize that that's safe. And as you lean into that, you're going to create more connection and what might be considered attachment. Right? We want to feel a sense of attachment to our friends, to our partners, to our children, to our family members. Even if they're not healthy, we still want an attachment to them because we want it to be better. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not weakness. It's normal. It's human. So that is an important part of this process. Now, the fear of becoming too attached, that does happen more in the sense of like becoming dependent on that person. And again, this is where your therapist has a significant responsibility in making sure that that doesn't happen. And kind of the goal in relational therapy, or really healing, is letting yourself learn that it's okay to trust, that it's okay to ask for support, that it's okay to share and connect. And for many people, their therapist is the only person that they do that with. And unfortunately, that's very normal, because people tend to have relationships with people that aren't necessarily really healthy or don't have the capacity to be that supportive. And with therapy, as you go on, realistically, you're likely going to need more support in those earlier stages than you do later on. Not more support as you get closer to healing, because you have the resources within yourself. You've been able to practice setting boundaries and bringing people into your life that are healthy. So you have other sources of support as time goes on. But it is quite normal that for many people, particularly with relational wounding and trauma wounding, that your therapist may be the only person that you have, that you talk to about the hard stuff. So your therapist, ideally, is really paying attention to that and supporting you and being there for you with boundaries, and also helping you get to a place where you can connect with other people outside of that therapeutic relationship. Because that is part of healing, is having it within ourselves to manage whatever difficult thing is going on. And if you've experienced trauma, you already have that within yourself. But it's managing it in a healthy way. But it's also about creating connection with other people. Now, that might be primarily one person, especially when it's about the really personal or traumatic kinds of things. There may be only one other person as time goes on. Or you might have a few people that maybe you talk about this particular thing with this person and then this thing with these other couple of people. And there's nothing at all wrong with that. In fact, that's pretty normal and can be incredibly healthy, because some people, you just have a certain level of connection. Like if you have hobbies in common, you're going to talk about different kinds of things than you talk about like your child's friend's parent, right? You're going to likely talk about kids stuff and parenting and all the stress around that. So you're going to have different people that you talk to about things, but your therapist is hopefully helping you get to a place where you practice leaning into that, where you practice allowing yourself to be open to other relationships, other connections. So one of the really important things that I want you to be able to understand about this is that when you are working with a therapist, in the beginning stages when you're trying to build that connection, or in the later stages, even as you're working to terminate the therapeutic work together, it is your therapist's role and your therapist's responsibility. Now, obviously, your therapist doesn't have responsibility over you, but your therapist does have a responsibility to help you kind of navigate that, to help you create that sense of connection while also helping you find the resources within yourself and externally so that you can feel supported and connected outside of that therapeutic relationship as time goes on. So, for example, for myself and my work with clients, there are many times that I am the only person that somebody talks to about this kind of stuff, about wounding, about healing, about struggle, all of that. Sometimes they don't even talk to their partner about it. I've had people that didn't even tell their partner that they were seeing me, which isn't ideal. And that's a topic for another day. But it's ultimately because they don't feel safe in doing that. And so in the beginning stages, and when I say beginning, it's not so much about time as it is the healing process. So in those beginning stages, I might be the only person that that person talks to, and that's okay. But, and a lot of times, again, the people around them may not be very healthy or capable of really being in a very mutual, supportive type of relationship. But I still, sometimes very specifically and directly, and sometimes not necessarily that way, encourage people to think about how they might connect with somebody else. How, like what their fears might be around that. I also encourage them, particularly in the beginning, to lean into trusting me and sharing with me, which sometimes takes people a really long time to be able to do. And I encourage that, and I have boundaries around that for sure. But I encourage that because the practicing and reaching out is an important piece of their healing. Being able to reach out, knowing that there are boundaries around that, can also be a really important part of that healing. And then over time, practicing in moments, allowing themselves to connect with other people, that is part of the healing process. So attachment in the therapeutic relationship, and again, how you define attachment may be a little bit different, but I think of it more as allowing yourself to feel connected, allowing yourself to feel a level of trust, allowing yourself to receive the support and the kindness and the care. When you have those thoughts of, well, they're just saying that because I pay them to. Like, really ask yourself, is it possible that this person might actually care about me or care about my healing? I'm pretty sure the answer is going to be yes. Well, actually, if you're asking yourself if it's possible, the answer is absolutely yes. When you're wondering if it's true, there's a good chance that it's very true. And some therapists are quite verbal about that, and some therapists are not. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the first one cares more than the second. It just means that their approach might be a little bit different. So if you have fears or concerns about becoming too dependent or too attached to your therapist, that's actually an important thing to talk about with your therapist. It really is, because the fear often isn't so much about the actual connection or attachment. The fear is often about abandonment. The fear is, if I'm too needy, I'm going to push this person away, which is ultimately being abandoned. So when those fears are present, it's important to be able to talk to your therapist about that. And as you move closer to ending the therapeutic work that you're doing together, those fears are likely going to come up in some way or another. It may not be a specific conscious thought like, oh, I'm afraid of this ending, but you might even find yourself feeling more easily frustrated with your therapist, or pushing your therapist away in some way, canceling sessions. So if you're talking with your therapist about that, then you can talk through a lot of that. Because one of the really difficult things that can happen in a therapeutic relationship and in the therapeutic work is people will sometimes get afraid. They'll feel like they're starting to care about the therapist, or that they want the therapy, or they want their therapist to care about them. And particularly if it's not conscious, they will often do something to kind of rupture that relationship. And maybe it's just never showing up again for a session, or maybe it's doing something to push that therapist away so that you can prove in your mind that they really never cared and they would abandon you eventually, because that affirms those core beliefs. So a lot of that can come up without you being consciously aware of it, which is why it's important to be able to talk about those fears with your therapist. And if you've watched many of my videos, you know that I talk about often the importance of talking about things with your therapist. The things that you think are weird or that you feel ashamed of, the fears that you have, even if they seem completely unreasonable. In fact, maybe even more so if they seem completely unreasonable, because there's a reason that fear is there. So, can you become too attached? Well, yeah, you can. But it's probably pretty unlikely. And again, it's your therapist's role and responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen. And there's a difference between feeling connected, allowing the support in, enjoying your sessions, and being too attached. So that's important to keep in mind as well, because we can sometimes feel, especially if we're very independent and don't really let people in, we can feel like any level of connection is too much, that it's somehow wrong or bad in some way. So it really is important to be able to talk through those things with your therapist. So I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments your thoughts, your experiences and reactions. Have you ever felt or feared being too attached, being too dependent on your therapist? This is something that is pretty naturally talked about in a lot of therapeutic relationships. Have you ever felt like you were too attached? You're not alone. Have you ever felt like you wish you could be more attached? Because that is not being too attached, but being attached is kind of an important part of the therapeutic process, especially when you're healing trauma wounding or relational wounding. It's part of the experience. It's part of the healing. And you've probably heard this before, and I know I've said it before, that relationship with your therapist sometimes, quite often really, is the most healing thing about the entire journey. Which is why it's so important to work with somebody who really understands what it means to be a trauma survivor, especially if it's childhood trauma. The complexity, the layering of what that means. So thanks for watching. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. If you're not subscribed, make sure you do so and click on the little bell for notifications. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, send it to qanda@courageousjourneys.com. The link will be in the description below. Thanks for watching. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.